Hello, LTX Quest. It's beautiful to be here today with you and this incredible group of people. I want to kick us off really just by having folks introduce themselves, like what do you do, where are your people from, and what issues in our community are you most passionate about? Want to kick us off, Bonnie?
Sure. Nice to meet you all. I'm Bonnie Oliva Porter. I run a consulting firm called Margins. It's a workplace innovation studio. And our goal is to amplify the voices of the most marginalized groups in the workplace. Because as we know, the workplace today was not designed for today's workforce. And so a lot of changes have to happen. So we're helping companies do that. My people are from Honduras. I was born and raised in the Bronx, so a child of two immigrant parents. And my family is Garifuna, so we are descendants of the shipwrecked African slaves that migrated through the Central Caribbean and trying to build all of that culture together. So one of the things that I'm really passionate about is learning more about my culture, learning more about my history. So thinking about how we all kind of came together, how we came to be. As a Black woman, I often get the question, what are you? And I find myself looking for that history so that I can repeat it as well, right? So I think through all of that. And when I was a child, I remember not being able to find that history because it wasn't available in the libraries. It wasn't available at school, so I had to go searching for it. So one of those things that I'm really passionate about and excited about is seeing how much more available that is today.
Thank you.
Awesome, that's great. So I'm Christian Arana. I'm the Vice President of Policy at the Latino Community Foundation. So we're a statewide philanthropic organization that supports grassroots Latino-led organizations across the state. The reason why we do what we do is because when you look at the data, less than 1% of all philanthropic dollars go towards our community. To put things into context, there are almost 16 million Latinos that live just in the state of California. And if you have less than 1% of the money going to the community, seems like there's a problem you need to fix, right? So to your question about who my people are, I always say my people are the delivery drivers. They're the maids or the janitors because that's my mom and dad. Those are my people. I wouldn't be at a table talking about these issues with you all today if it wasn't for them. I'm very cognizant of that. I carry that with me. We're Central Americans, so we're Guatemalans. So when you said from Honduras, I'm like, sister, right? There you go.
I'm Guatemalan too.
There you go. See, this wasn't done on purpose, people, right? Yeah, the things that I'm passionate about, I don't know, you just turn on the news, it seems like I have a new passion every day, things that outrage me. But I think for me right now, I'm a recent homeowner. So I just bought property for the first time. And thank you, yeah, that was a struggle. And it infuriates me because it doesn't have to be like that. And I was privileged and blessed to do something like that. And what gets me particularly upset is that why can't that be for everyone else? And so through the work that I do in terms of policy and grant making, how do we get our community at the forefront to make sure that they're the ones speaking out for the solutions that they want to see for their community?
Thank you.
My name is Joshua Encarnacion. I serve as a leadership development consultant. So I work with companies that are thinking about the employee life cycle in a holistic way. Trying to make sure that our people are represented. And so when you ask who are our people, I often think about Black and brown people first. Being from the Caribbean, I'm Dominican, so not necessarily, gonna follow the trend, but I think a lot about what's that plight being first, right? My father was born in the Dominican Republic. My mother was born in Queens, New York. So I'm 1.5 generations. So even in that, it's unique. And having been raised with someone that's deeply rooted in the island that they came from, and then with someone that's American through and through, you just have a completely different perspective on what it means to go first, right? Maybe the first person to go to Home Depot after you bought a home.
That's right. I got a credit card now from Home Depot.
Yeah, just like Christian, I'm a recent homeowner, and so I come up against a lot of those questions, right? Like the first time I heard about escrow.
Right?
Which is a huge conversation that's not happening in our communities. And when I say our communities, I mean communities of Black and brown people.
Right.
So I'm not necessarily thinking about just Black American or Caribbean American or Latino, Latina, Latine, Latinx American. I'm thinking about Black and brown people specifically. And so the work that I do is rooted in that perspective, but it doesn't necessarily show up in the language. So leadership development consulting allows me to work as a coach, as a consultant, as an advisor for a lot of companies that are having their way when it comes to access to capital, but not distributing it in an equitable way. And so for me, having been trained as a human resources professional, it's really easy for me to help people think about hiring differently, training differently, managing differently, and just showing up for the folks in their organizations in a way that's a lot more balanced.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to be clear, I am Guatemalan and Mexican, because I'm not going to forget my mama. But I think what was interesting about my upbringing is my pop came to the country immigrated at a time when becoming a permanent resident was possible, and went to schools where they would hit him if he spoke Spanish, right? And I grew up around, him being rightfully conspiracy theorizing, because he grew up in a really, right near where the United Fruit Company had been. If y'all don't know about that, get to know. And my mom was Mexican and came here, overstayed a visa, and the beginnings of my childhood were the pains of that residency process, but she was very pro-America, right? And so both of those things made me. And I think that I always think about the impact of colonization on all of us, right? And what does it mean not just to move ourselves, but to move our families out of some of the mindsets that come with colonization? And I'd just be really curious to hear any of the experiences that you all have had around that, and how have you balanced being a person people who have obviously been in the study of all of this with families that may not necessarily know all of the information around it. Some do, but
I'll start there. So the impacts of colonization, right, are felt minute to minute, second to second. I grew up with a mother that had me at 15 years of age and a father that was deported when I was 9 years old. So what I had learned through their experience was that they were fighting to survive a system that wasn't designed with them in mind. And because of that, they need to have their needs met before they can meet the needs of the people they have to provide for. I was that first child they had to provide for. So there was a lot of questions they didn't have answers to. And by the time I matured in my thinking to understand what role colonization is playing in our family, I had realized that I was solving problems not just for myself, but for them as well. And being asked, what are you? Similar to how Bonnie had mentioned in her intro, makes you
prototypical Latina question.
Right?
What are you?
Right. It really does put you in a position to have to decide who are you going to represent and who are you going to leave behind, which is why to me, Black and Brown is a lot more appropriate than even claiming Latino, Latina, Latinx, because it's constantly separating us through these labels. And because language is so powerful, if it doesn't remain fluid, then you're actively discriminating against people that you grew up with due to the shades that represent all of us. My father's side of the family is a lot darker. My mother's side of the family is a lot lighter. And there was jokes growing up where people would come over and be like, you guys are like a pack of Skittles. And that's kind of funny if you don't live it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And then, when you leave the front door and you realize that people are not going to assume that you speak Spanish because of the facial features you have or the color of your skin, you start to realize we're segregating even further. And because even in the Caribbean, we have 50 flags. I know in Mexico it's very similar, where there's a million ways to talk about Mexico. You bring all that to a place like the United States, and it's what color are you gonna wear? But we're not talking about gangs, or we're not talking about companies even. We're talking about where our identity is rooted in. And so just having to have that interaction constantly is exhausting. And knowing that you're doing the work to unpack that.
Yeah, I think unpacking that from a young age was something that I became very aware of when I went to boarding school. So I grew up in the Bronx. I was a smart kid. I got scholarships to great schools. I went to an incredible middle school, and then I got a full scholarship to Phillips Academy, Andover, Massachusetts, one of the best schools in the country. And it was amazing. It was great. And my parents always instilled in me, rooted in us, like education is the key, right? You have to get a good education, go to the best schools, and then you're gonna get a good job, and then you're gonna make a lot of money. And I just thought that was the path. And getting to the school, while I had wonderful experiences, I also had a lot of questions. And I was always a person who asked why. And even the path that I took to get to that school and then to college and grad school and beyond, I realized early on that it wasn't for everyone. It wasn't for all of my people, right? I was always an other. I was always an outsider. And while we were able to find other folks kind of like us and band together, it was rare. And I always got bothered by this sense of, oh, you're one of the good ones. And that always really pissed me off. I was like, the people I grew up around are good people, right? They're human, they're wonderful, they're smart. They just all didn't have the same opportunity. And that, when I realized that unfairness, I was like, oh, I gotta do something about this. That kind of lit a fire under me. And so that's one of the reasons why, in our work, just thinking about how do we create fairness and equity in the workplace, it's because not everyone got here the same way. And so we have to consider that and think about that as we're building these companies for the next generation. So that's one of the things that I really, really think about a lot.
If I could share a quick story, how I started. My dad's a delivery driver, he delivers pizza. And I was thankful to go to Georgetown University for undergrad. And one night, my dad called me, and he's like, I had the funniest interaction with a customer. I was like, Dad, what's up? It was cold, so my dad was wearing the Georgetown sweater that I got for him, right? And so this woman opened the door. It was a white woman wearing a UC Santa Barbara t-shirt. And my dad asked her, hey, like, you go to UC Santa Barbara? She's like, yeah. And she's like, oh, Georgetown, like how do you know about that? And my dad was like, oh, well, my son goes to Georgetown. And she was just like, what? Your son goes to Georgetown? And my dad was like, why is that hard to believe that the son of a brown man that can go to a place like that? Like, why would that be a problem for someone's mind? And so those little experiences, even in my own personal life, like led me to make these career choices that I've made. My first job out of college, it's funny, like you guys talk about New York. My first job out of college was, I moved to New York. I worked at a predominantly low-income school that served Black and Latino students up at 106 in Park. I was literally, the school was across the street from the BET studios. And I was a college counselor there. And I remember, there was the whole work trying to get a student into college. But once they actually got in, there were so many conversations about, like, why am I going to go? These places are not for me.
So and I'm sorry for interrupting, but talking about that pyramid effect that happens for all of us, where at the beginning, like, you look around and 100% of the people you see are like you, and then you get to high school and it's 75%, and you're like, wait, there's a white kids table, and then you get to college and then it's 25%, and then you start your first job and you're the 1%. And then the entire career journey is trying to explain why you are the 1%. And I think it goes back to colonization's impact through time. And it's interesting how they make us read about it like it happened a million years ago when it was just yesterday.
Yeah, I'm always repeating to folks that high wage, mid-wage, and salaried work in America is segregated. That, like, you can see it in the data. After the $60,000 mark, it's like a nosedive in our representation. And it's like, and in every single industry, and not proportionate to college going rates, right? Like, there are people who go to college and are kept out of high wage, mid-wage, and salaried work. And, I think that how could that not have an impact on our relationship to money, right? And, y'all were talking about home ownership earlier and all that. Like, I'd be really curious about what your own relationship to money has been. Has it differed from your families at all? And what lessons are you taking with you right now, especially as we're watching a very shaky United States, not so United States, teeter into a recession and maybe even worse economic catastrophes?
Yeah, and if I can start off with that, as I mentioned, I just bought a home. I live with this fear every single day that something bad can happen to me. Because that was the upbringing that I had. Like, my parents didn't have health insurance. So I had this mentality that I can get into a car accident and there goes all my life savings. The interesting part is, like, I have a good job, that I have healthcare, right? But there are all these questions about what if? What if I get this one random bill where I have to give $50,000? Like, I don't have that kind of money. And so in a way, this is why therapy has actually been very helpful for me, because it's like, I'm trying to work out of that mentality. And it's interesting. I mean, like, I feel like I do well for myself now, but like, because I had the experience growing up with my parents, it will forever be a part of my DNA.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like, I'm immunocompromised, which is why I'm wearing the mask today. I got sick with COVID in March of 2020. So I was in the first wave of people and spent a year in bed, essentially, and got out of a walker in February 2021 and have been in recovery ever since. I was doing the math of how much I had a CEO job at the time, a really good health insurance. And just this week, I was doing the math of how much money I paid in out-of-pocket expenses over the course of the last 2.5 years. And it was close to $24,000. For a catastrophe that I never saw coming, right? And so I not to contribute to your the reactivity, right? Like, but it is not, and that is on me. There is no one in my family who's going to cover that check, right? And so it's really interesting to watch as we navigate, in particular, as like things are getting much more precarious.
I think my relationship with money is evolving, right? I think as I grow up. I mean, I'm getting this age right now, and thinking about not just myself, but I have a 4-year-old son. My husband. We have a family, a partnership. But I also think about my mother, who is no longer working. My father passed away a few years ago, and he was the kind of provider in our household. And so, thinking about what else can I build to be able to help out as much as possible without leading back into that scarcity mindset, because I've always grown up with that scarcity. It's part of our kind of DNA. There's never enough, right? And so when there's never enough, you want to kind of keep whatever you have. And so thinking a little bit more about what are other opportunities to invest. I was at a venture-backed company for 10 years in operations, and that's when I learned about VC funding and all of the things companies do to grow and how you have to spend to grow and things like that. So there's still a balance that I have to figure out for myself personally. And that really opened up my eyes to all that is out there. I was actually watching CNBC this morning, because I do things like that now. And one of the pundits on there was talking about his investments, and he was like, well, I'm investing in this debt collection company because we're going into a recession and we're going to need more debt collection, and that's going to basically make us a lot of money. And I was like, wow, people think like that. Yeah. When I've always thought about debt collection, I was like, we want to stay as far away as possible, but here people are on TV talking about investing in debt collection
companies. Like it ain't nothing, right?
Yeah.
Like,
oh my God.
Other people's suffering is coming. How do we capitalize on this?
And I was like, what? And I'm still processing it like in real time, but it's incredible, like how much we just don't know. We just don't know out there, and different ways that we can just start learning more about investing and finding ways to maximize what we do have, as opposed to being so afraid that it's going to go away one day. But there's a balance, right? It's not one or the other.
100% a balance. And I was raised on the complete other end of that spectrum. So I didn't have that same fear, in the sense that my family got here with nothing, so we couldn't really lose anything. So there was no fear around keeping something. So because of that, I had to, through therapy, unlearn behaviors that are deeply rooted in you only live once, right? And like, just make it happen. Just go ahead. Might as well just throw the kitchen sink, because you made this out of nothing, you'll do it again. And that mindset can be powerful in one way, but dangerous in another, because you forget to think about the future. And so my relationship to money that had no ties to investments whatsoever. And I think with maturity, it's been thinking about how do you create systems that serve themselves without you having to be the main source of energy, let's say, right?
I want to come back to the money question, but all of us have talked about therapy a couple times in this panel. And like, that is not a standard practice, should we say, in our community.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'd be curious about how you got to the stage where you were like, yep, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to therapy. And how has it benefited you to invest in yourself in that way?
6 years of therapy, best investment I think I've ever made in my entire life. And I come from a family where you say therapy, y eso de gente blanca, right? So it's not like I had support in my family to go to see a therapist, right? But I knew for a fact that I had to have some of those difficult conversations, which is all that therapy really represents, is having those conversations that you can't necessarily have by yourself, and you might need the aid of somebody that has already had them. And I was able to open up about situations that happened at a young age that brought me to this point, right? But to get to that next point, I might have to think about them differently. And so, to your question, I think it's really like, how available are you to want to have these conversations in a new way? And I think part of the problem in our communities is that we are so close to each other, that love is so deep, that we don't want to talk about these things with anyone else, right? And so for me, having a father that was deported at a young age, I only thought I could have that conversation with my mother. Wasn't autoimmune deficiency, but being diagnosed with atrial fibrillation at a young age, where my heart literally jumps out of rhythm and I had to get cardioverted. It's happened 13 times, clear, 13 times, right? You don't want to have that conversation with anyone else, right? And how does that impact your outlook on life? Beyond that, having people ask you what you look like constantly, how do you create a new response to that? And how do you create it in multiple languages? Because I remember trying to figure out my therapist to see if they're going to understand me in Dominican Spanish, which is very different than any other. So I think it's tough, but it's having that availability to wanting to think about these things differently.
Yeah, I think therapy has been a part of my life for more than half my life at this point. I think that one of the great things about having been at a school that had all these resources is you had therapy. And one of the things I learned, though, is that this therapist was not for me. So I learned that very early on, like who I have to, who I can really relate to, and who that therapist is really important. And that relationship is really important. And because it's been a part of my life for so long, when I talk to my family about it, I just try to really remove the shame from it. It's like, this is something that I do. It helps me be who I am. I enjoy it. It's not something that I do because I'm forced. And I think talking about it more openly has made it so that other members of my family can just say, yeah, I'm doing that as well. So I think there's a little bit of normalizing it and just talking about it without a lot of it, without being something that's hugely different, and letting folks know that there are different ways to find therapy and therapists. And that it's more of a relationship that is really important, that helps you get to the next level.
Yeah, I've been watching my mama go to therapy for the first time. And she's like, oh, I just learned that from you that, this may be something I need to do. And it has been a game changer for our conversations, right? And she really can start to hold both the compassion for the situations that she was in that forced her into the reactions that she had, and understand that there's something more that she wants for herself, her kids, and her grandkids. And it's been phenomenal. And it's so nice to be able to sit back and be like, all that work helped show, right? What the benefits of that work could be like.
Well, yeah, what I was going to say too is that even my own scope of work, with the investments that we do into our nonprofit organizations across the state, I feel like too often philanthropy says, here's a bunch of money late in the game, go out and get people out to vote, right? Or whatever it is, right? But people should understand, you can't just tell people to go out to vote when we just experienced 4 years of Donald Trump. People are traumatized, right?
Yeah.
And they need any help that they can get, right? And so, as I was mentioning, I've gone to therapy, and for me, it's been incredibly helpful just to, I feel safe, doing it, right? But then it just motivates me to think about in any of our positions, right? How do we can do that for others? Obviously, starting in my own family and just normalizing it, because I think in your case, they said it was for white people. In my case, it's that's for crazy people, as they quote. But no, it's for everybody.
Could also be, it's for rich people.
Yeah, I've heard that too. Yeah, so so just interesting how in my line of work in philanthropy, it's we expect so much of our community, but we'll do nothing to help them. And so the more I can try to be an advocate for something especially as important as this, like we should.
Well, I mean, we've mentioned a couple of times the shakiness of the country currently, and how hard that it can be to deal with in our day-to-day work, especially for people that are working in spaces that want to create justice. As that starts to happen, as that shakiness is really setting in and becoming a day-to-day part of our lives, like I think it's been both surprising to some and like, whoa, all of this isn't going away. Like it's not like it's going to disappear and things are going to go back to normal. Whether that's money, whether that's therapy, like what do you want our community to know? How should we start preparing for the next stages of what is coming next in the country?
I will make a quick point and say, because in the question you mentioned how the impact really touches justice-seeking professionals. Mm-hmm. I think it's beyond that.
Yeah, that's true.
Because the world is moving towards more need for knowledge-based work and emotional labor. Mm-hmm. And because of our decision to lean into that emotional labor, which I imagine was born out of the fact that we do knowledge work, we're reaping the benefits. And I feel as if our communities need to learn that knowledge work is not going away and it's gonna become more dominant. And I don't think that's an easy conversation to drive because we're so used to work being something that's physically represented. And to your question, if we can continue to invite the rest of our communities into this knowledge work and emotionally laborious services, then we'll start to normalize more of these therapy-based conversations or therapeutic conversations, which can evolve to coaching-based conversations, education-based conversations, management-based conversations.
I think there's something in this around how we think about preparing for work as well, because again, I grew up with this whole, like, you have to go to great schools to get a great job. And I think as the workforce changes and workplaces change, there's a difference for how you can prepare for jobs. And even in the last recession, I specifically worked on a number of programs for job training for the most marginalized folks in the job market, the most marginalized job seekers. And, hopefully it won't get to that point, but we were able to the government funneled a lot of money into job training and placement and making sure that folks were being placed into jobs that were not just like, here's a minimum wage job, go home. It's more like, here's a job and here's some career paths that we can really help you lean into. And so I think that in this next wave, as we prepare for that, just start seeking out what are the different ways and opportunities to get prepared for jobs. What does that look like, and where is that coming from? Are they nonprofit organizations? Are they coming from the government? Because it will come. I mean, my colleagues are kind of circling the wagons now, just being like, we're going to prepare for this because we know it's going to happen. And I think that just folks knowing that, then having that information out there and saying, like, there are different ways to seek opportunities for training. What are certifications? What are certain licenses that we can get so that we can, kind of share the love around knowledge around those jobs that might be opening up eventually.
Well, yeah, and just to add to that, we're still in a pandemic. This pandemic has not finished. And so something that we've learned is that you look at who is most affected by this. It was people of color, immigrants, like you name it, right? And just going along the jobs piece, my conversations with my friends in my own little circles is that jobs, yes, like we got to get those high paying jobs, but what makes a good job, right? It's the fact that if I get sick, I should be able to stay home and be sick and not lose out on a paycheck, right? It's paid family leave. It's, just so many other access to healthcare, right? And so what I hope our community knows in the next couple of years is that you basically saved this country, if not the world, right? And this is literally, this is a moment to get yours, right? Because if we all stopped working today, this country shuts down. It's as simple as that. And it's going to take a lot of organizing for that oomph to happen. It is happening, right? But I'm a relentless optimist, right? So day by day, I think we're getting closer. there, but this is the time period where we are redesigning our society. And so I want our community especially to be at the forefront of that.
I think at the forefront of decision-making, because I mean, as you all know very well, I feel like a lot of these opportunities that we do need to be trained for, that are, again, rooted in knowledge work and emotional labor, often get delegated away to people that don't understand what decisions are being made behind the curtains, in closed doors, at round tables. And so preparing the folks that are already well invested into a knowledge-based career for management and leadership is very important, in addition to introducing people to knowledge-based work at scale. So more of these systems reproducing that training is probably what's going to get us to that big oomph, like you called it.
I've been defining power as the ability to change my life and other people's lives through access to money, access to information, access to decision makers, access to a megaphone, and access to decision-making rights. And the big shift really being that the internet gave us pieces of the first 4, but not at all the last one, which is decision-making rights, and been really fascinated by watching in places where decision-making rights are given to people and people give them back because the trade-offs in the decisions are not appetizing, and that is like meaning that people making the decisions, don't get me wrong, like there's a lot of hoarding of that decision-making power, but like the people often making the decisions are least impacted by like the consequences of those decisions. So the people making the trade-offs are much less attached. And, like our community is split right now with a conservative minority and a liberal majority, and it is shifting all of the time. And I am watching, a variety of things happen as folks are trying to get our vote or get our participation, but not want to have to work for it, right? And I'm curious about what you think the role of politics is in our community.
Well, let me take a stab at that. I feel like we could talk about this all day, but unfortunately, it has to take a large role because until we have these positions that make decisions over our lives, like it's going to be incredibly difficult, right? So I'll be honest with you, like the midterms are coming up, like
gotta get mollywopped.
it's hard. Like so for someone like myself who votes all the time, like I kind of don't want to vote because for what? Things don't change. If not, they're getting worse, right? And I know this is being aired. I'm still going to vote, but it's if anything, I think our society is too focused on national politics, like the Trump, Congress, Democrats, Republicans, when in reality, they should be focusing on the local level because the more immediate decisions over people's lives are affected there. And those positions, whether it be mayor, city council, sheriff, whatever, school board, like those seats are decided by like 200-300 votes, right? So, there's a difference between someone who's on the progressive side versus someone that's going to make your life completely miserable, right? So looking ahead to this year's elections, we're filming here in Los Angeles. Like we have a mayor's race, we have a sheriff's race, new city council members. A very progressive abolitionist city council member just won here in the city of Los Angeles, and that came out as homegirl said, "You know what? This is dumb, and I'm going to do something about it." Right?
It's a beautiful campaign to watch too. Whoa,
and so it kills me that not everyone feels like that, because in that example, that particular community organizer, took it upon herself to do that, challenge an incumbent, and it was a powerful story. And so, how do we get more of us to do that?
Well, I think it requires a baseline level of safety. I mean, I am not ignorant to politics whatsoever, but I'm not much of a political organizer, nor am I nearly as involved as I think I could be. But for reasons that I feel protect me and my family, in the sense that we needed to make $1 and again and again and again. And when that conversation gets handled, but I guess that could be a very selfish way to think about things politically. But I know it represents a big voice for a lot of us, because if these systems are changing without our input, because decision makers are hoarding that power, survival becomes the number one question, especially in the face of a pandemic. So like my first job out of college, I earned double what my family's ever made at capacity, with a mother that has 2 master's degrees. Unheard of, insane, whatever you want to call it. People have said all sorts of things, right? But then the first thing became, how does this become the norm? Not how do we go to change policies so this doesn't happen anymore, which I think is so far because we are so left out. So I wonder sometimes what type of engagement will reach our communities when what you're saying is so true.
I mean, I think that that's part of the key, right? Is thinking about how do we engage our communities and what does organizing look like at the local levels, because that is so incredibly important. How do we make it interesting for folks to participate? Because I think a lot of times the way we talk about politics, it's so exclusionary, right? It's like, okay, this is this big thing that's happening over there. You don't know enough to know about it, so just vote for this guy because this is the guy that's going to help you versus that guy. And it's kind of insane that we don't. It's just kind of interesting to me that we don't get into it at the more like granular levels, what's happening locally. Where I'm from, in the Bronx, the local politicians are very engaged in the community, and so you see them out and about, and you see them with folks. And so hopefully, that picks up a little bit more, because we have some like new folks who are joining into the system, who are raising their hands and saying, I'm going to vote for this race, and trying to find ways to communicate and connect with their constituents, which I'm so excited to see, because I didn't see that growing up. And so I think that that's what we need more. And I think social media helps a little bit with that too, so ways to reach folks.
Well, it's democratizing awareness.
Right.
I feel very similar. Like, I did not see anyone do anything politically growing up.
No.
If anything, it was stay as far away as possible, because you might find the police. So like,
well, and on that point, I mean, I always say that, and especially in Black and brown communities, like, don't be mad when people are cynical and disillusioned. And also, like, how on earth do you expect someone, whether here it's in LA or in the Bronx or whoever, how on earth do you expect somebody to vote for something or someone they've never met?
Exactly.
Period.
Yeah, I mean, and there's a thing, right, around how, like, I think my family did a really good job of being like, we work with what we got, right? And we work within the system that we got, and here's what we can do. But I would say that it was way later in my life that I created a political imagination of what more we could get, right? And like, it's been fascinating to me to look at the stuff happening in labor right now, and this choice. Like, we had eliminated child poverty by like, what, 30-40% in the country because of the stuff that had come out in the economic package. And literally, we made a choice. We're like, ooh, that makes a really empowered worker that can create actions and do and wreak hell on their CEOs. And we were like, an empowered worker or child poverty? And we were like, child poverty. Right. That's what we're gonna do. Right. And like, there is a way to help tell that story, but we have to be telling it the way it impacts people in the smallest ways, in order for them to get how it connects to the bigger one.
Well, I'll be the cynical one who's telling that story, because it's not us.
Yeah.
And that's I think what the issue is. And I hear you loud and clear, right? It'd be great to have more of us supporting each other. And I think that ties back to the colonization, right? Like, how do we support each other as Black and brown people beyond the labels that we all want to fall into? Because at this point, I feel like that doesn't represent our identity as closely as we think it does.
Well, I mean, and there are like all sorts of frictions in our identity too, right? Like there's been a lot of questions about whether Latinidad is serving us, right? And I'm hearing you say Black and brown people, like, I don't feel like I, as a light-skinned, like, white Latina, can claim Black or brown. And I also know that I had a very different, like, my facial features, my shape, like, all of that. No one has ever mixed me up with a white person, but and I was treated differently, but nowhere near the impacts of like darker skinned people in my community, right? And so there's a variety of experiences, and folks are starting to question, is that label serving us? And I would be fascinated to hear what you all think.
I struggle with what that even means, Latinidad, and who's at the center of that definition. Because when I think about Latinidad, to me, it seems that at the center is, the white Latinos or Latinos of European descent that represents what we see kind of in the telenovelas. And I never saw myself represented in those types of, in any media around Latinx, Latinos, really, unless they were like the help, right? The maids. And so even in my work, kind of, we think about how do we recenter the folks that are on the margins? Because when you design for the margins, you're serving everyone. But most of the time, we're designing for those mainstreams. And Latinidad, I think, is one of those things that we need to kind of redesign it and reposition it so that we are figuring out who is on the margins of our overall culture, and how do we serve each other? How do we serve everyone? What voices are missing? It's an exercise I do with my clients. Like, what voices are missing here when we need to redesign our culture? It's something that I think that as a people, it'd be good to do, because again, going back to my obsession with our own history, thinking about what are the indigenous populations and and what happened to different groups. What are the ones that still exist? What are the ones that don't exist? What are some of the languages and the food and the music and the things that we might have lost over the years? And how do we reconnect to that? And a lot of that isn't, doesn't seem to be reflected right now in that kind of how we define Latinx, Latinidad. And it's starting to. I'm seeing more of it. I'm seeing more of us kind of come out and just say, yeah, this is how I identify. And I think that, we're starting that conversation from now, and hopefully it'll continue to evolve.
Well, yeah, and just very quickly to that, because I'm starting to see a whole lot more of it too. I think what frustrates me about this conversation sometimes is that, and when I see out in the world today, like some people deciding who gets to belong and who doesn't, and it's just like, my goodness, like.
Well, that's colonization again, right?
Exactly. And it's like, and who are you again, right? And so, and even then, I feel like this particular question has come up in the last 24 hours because, according to the White House, I guess we're all breakfast tacos from San Antonio. But it just, my goodness, it's a complicated subject. It's complicated questions, but it's important that we keep talking about it. Whether it's at these tables, out in the streets, at our small businesses, wherever, because I'm just afraid that if we just turn away from it, it actually impacts policy and politics and business and everything else.
Yeah.
Well, the impact comes from the sense of agency, right? So I think, again, where Latinidad is obviously accepted as something that's extremely nuanced, if you learn to use language that way, right? Because we don't all use language that way, but it is extremely nuanced. It's related to therapy, where we learn that we don't all ascribe to a single story.
Yeah.
Right? So now our identity is not a single story. I take it constantly and consistently to the granular level of being of Caribbean descent, where you definitely don't have a single story, because you either are ascribing to the African plight or the indigenous or the European, right, impact. And especially at a place where if you do the work to understand the history, you learn where Black was originated as a term. You start to understand, this was engineered, right? And so if you take it to a place of science and reasoning, you start to see, again, this is just colonization at scale. So we're having these conversations that's detracting from us coming together around our identity. And now we're having the question, what is the center? What are we coming together around? Where, like you, Bonnie, telenovelas didn't have dudes with beards either. And again, as light-skinned as I am, I still have to live in the world as a Black Hispanic man, and there's still not a lot of space for that. Not to try to create the spectrum of where are we neglected the most, but when you start to play that game, it's distracting us from the impact on business, the impact on education, on government, the impact on policy, which at points I can understand where we need to be patient with most folks around this conversation, gets frustrating because it's like we're still being robbed.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. It's been really beautiful being in conversation with you and excited to be in community more. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, awesome.
It was good meeting you.
Thank you.
Thank you.